Hello, and welcome to the third episode of Arbiter of Worlds. Today, we're going to discuss the F word. It's a word so obscene, I can barely bring myself to say it. Fudge. Fudging the dice. To fudge the dice means that you disregard what you or a player rolled, and you insert an outcome that you think is better. And every time as a GM you pick up the dice, you are toying with fate. The fate of the players, the fate of the adversaries, the fate of the campaign world. And when those dice come up in ways that were unexpected, when something happens that you don't like, the temptation is enormous to use your godlike GM powers to just fudge. Some GMs fudge so regularly they barely even look at the dice. But fudging is like the dark side of the Force. It's quick, it's easy, it's seductive, but in the end, it's ugly and ruinous. The GM is cackling, "Everything is proceeding as I have foreseen." Yeah, buddy, that's because you're cheating to force the outcome you want, right? Don't be Emperor Palpatine at the table. Actually, fudging is worse than the dark side, because fudging is infectious. If you learn how to GM from another GM who fudges the dice, then you too will be infected with the fudge virus. Fudgers create other fudgers. And at this point, it's like a pandemic of epic proportions in our hobby. It's like a zombie apocalypse. It's a sexually transmitted disease without any sex. Fudging is syphilis for game masters. Actually, fudging is even worse than syphilis because at least the corporations don't put syphilis in the products that they sell us. Wizards of the Coast, on the other hand, actually puts fudging in their rules. They want you to get infected. They're like a bioweapons manufacturer. I'm going to read some GM advice published by Wizards of the Coast in one of their Dungeon Master guides. And this advice comes at the end of their chapter teaching you how to create story arcs for your campaign, which you shouldn't do. But we'll come back to that in a future episode. Anyway, it's their advice on how to conclude your campaign. I've got it up on my screen, so let me read it to you. They say, "Plan carefully to see that the conclusive scenes of your campaign pay off. By centering the entire campaign on a set of victory conditions, you're promising a big, exciting finish. Prepare that final sequence exhaustively. It must be exquisitely balanced. Set up the climactic sequence so that your resident tacticians have no chance to reconnoiter or plan in advance. Design the encounter with options that allow you to adjust its difficulty on the fly. And when in doubt, fudge die rolls shamelessly, feigning surprise at the results." Now, the inherent assumption here is that the GM is this wise, smart entertainer, and the players are his audience and along for the ride, or they're nuisances who will attempt to ruin your ending with their reconnaissance and planning. If you've watched my prior videos, you already know why you should disregard everything that was written above. But I think it's worth translating their language from corporate speak into plain speech. What they're actually saying is this. Plan carefully to see that the conclusive scenes of your campaign arbitrarily end the way you want them to. By centering the entire campaign on a set of victory conditions, you've put yourself in a situation where you have to railroad the ending. So you'd better prepare that final sequence exhaustively. It must be exquisitely balanced so that they almost lose, but then they win no matter what choices they make. Set up the climactic sequence so that your resident tacticians have no path except your path, no matter how much they might want to choose otherwise. And ignore any sense of fairness to the players, and design the encounter with options that allow you to arbitrarily make it harder or easier for the players, so that they end up doing what you want, how you want, when you want them to. And when in doubt, just lie to your players about what you rolled and make up an outcome you think is better. Don't do any of this. Don't do any of it. It is the worst game master advice ever given. The agency theory of fun, which I hold to, says you should never fudge a meaningful die roll. And I'm going to say that again, it's important. Never fudge a meaningful die roll. Full stop, no excuses, don't do it. Never fudge a meaningful die roll. The entire desire to fudge is founded on this faulty premise that you have to make sure people have fun. But that's not your job. It's your job to offer the possibility of fun. And it's absolutely a mistake to believe that letting a character destroys the possibility of fun. In fact, the opposite is true. It's fudging the dice that destroys fun. by destroying the ability for the players to make meaningful choices. At this point, I've already made at least some GMs angry, right? Like one of you is already penning a response in the comments to tell me that if I'm opposed to fudging, then I don't know the first thing about GMing. These people take the view that the job is to let the players enjoy a great story, and they see a meaningless death as a fail state, right? And friend, I once believed as you do, but now I believe otherwise. I've been a game master for 41 years, right? I was like a child prodigy. I started running Dungeons and Dragons at age 7. I have run at least 1 and sometimes 2 sessions a week in virtually unbroken succession my entire life, save for 3 years at Harvard Law School where I studied rules lawyering. I've run for children, for teens, for adults. I've run for boomers, Xers, millennials. I've run almost every system under the sun. And I've run the most carefully plotted story arcs you can imagine. I mean, I once ran the entirety of Babylon 5, reskinned as a fantasy game, down to the time travel loop at all. And of course, to do it, I fudged shamelessly. But looking back at that experience, looking back now, it was like being in Plato's cave and mistaking the shadows for the real experience. When I stopped fudging and I started offering meaningful agency to my players, then it was like stepping outside into the bright light of day. And after I did that, I never wanted to go back into that cave. Another common response I get when I share my views on fudging is that my advice should only apply to newbie GMs, because experienced GMs can fudge so smoothly that their players never know. Again, friends, I once believed as you believe, but now I believe otherwise. The players know. If you're fudging, they know. In fact, fudging is so endemic to our hobby that if you make your GM rolls in secret, even if you're not fudging, they assume you are and they play accordingly. You can easily test this for yourself. If you're a GM who typically rolls behind a GM screen, I want you to give this a try, right? Next session, announce that you'll be making the enemy's attacks and damage rolls in the open. I guarantee you your players will act differently, very differently. They are going to take the game so much more seriously. They're going to be anxious about the outcome of every roll. They're going to be on the edge of their seats. Why? Because you've taken away the training wheels. You've taken away the bowling bumpers. And now they know they're suddenly playing a real game with real consequences. So related to that, I want to share an actual play anecdote. It first came up in a BX campaign that I used to run for my friends at The Escapist. And a new player had just joined the campaign. We'll call her Carrie because that's what her name is. And Carrie rolled up an elven spellsword for her first session. So Carrie was on the Escapist art team, and she was like this amazing illustrator. And so after she rolled up her character, she takes the time to sketch out this beautiful drawing of her, new player character. And it was like heartwarming to see the enthusiasm. So of course, in the very first round of the very first combat of the very first session, Carrie rushes forward and a goblin fires an arrow at her. And I roll the dice in the open, and so I roll a natural 20, so it's an automatic hit, and then I roll a 6 for damage, and it's right there for everyone to see. 6 hit points is a killing blow for a first level elven spell sword, and everyone at the table is just stunned, right? Carrie is sitting there with her mouth open, all eyes are on me, and I realize this is a crucial moment for the whole campaign. Because if I fudge, if I come up with an excuse, then I've destroyed my campaign. Now, everyone knows we're playing with Nerf weapons in a world where we just pretend bad things might actually happen, but actually they won't happen because the GM will fix it. No. So what did I do? What I actually did was I spewed out just an over-the-top death scene for her, right? I'm like, arrow punctures the soft flesh of your neck just below the trachea, penetrates through your spine, and suddenly you're boneless and you collapse onto the dungeon floor. And as you lay there watching as the pavement turns red, you realize it's your blood, and then you're gone. And what does Carrie do? She rolls up another character, and she goes on to play an entire campaign with us. And it's one of the best campaigns I've run, because everyone knew, right then, they knew the stakes were real, the choices were real. Now, this campaign is actually how you got the Adventure Conquer King system. It grew right out of that campaign. So I'm speaking from experience. I have run both story-driven games with lots of fudging, and I've run sandbox games with no fudging. And the difference is profound. The difference between a game with fudging and a game without fudging, it's like the difference between WWF wrestling and Olympic wrestling, right? So both involve like large, sweaty men in close proximity to each other. They both involve a lot of combat. but one is fake and one is real, right? One makes your players into actors in your drama, and the others lets your players try to become champions. All right, so now that I've bashed on fudging, I'm going to totally confuse you by saying that actually there's 2 occasions where you should fudge. Now, remember earlier I said you should never fudge a meaningful die roll. The key word there is meaningful. So what makes a die roll meaningful or meaningless? And the short answer is that you can fudge a die roll when it is so meaningless, so trivial, that fudging it improves play without impacting the ability of the players to make any meaningful choices. As an example of this general point, let me walk you through this scene. Imagine there's 8 player characters and they're about to attack one easy-to-hit adversary who only has 2 hit points remaining. And the first player character is Victor, and he hits, but then he rolls a 1 for damage. Now, in this circumstance, it might be appropriate for the DM to just fudge the adversary's remaining hit points so that Victor's damage is enough to kill, just in the interest of speed of play, right? The adversary is going to die regardless. And, depending on the system, going through the attack routine of another character will just waste a lot of time that might be better spent on more meaningful play. But note I said it might be appropriate to fudge, because it might not be, right? If the adversary is like a notorious warlord, and whoever lands the killing blow is going to earn a lot of honor, then who lands the killing blow is meaningful. If Victor wants to kill the adversary, but his comrade Quintus, who's next in the round, wants to capture the adversary, then the fact that Victor didn't kill the adversary is very meaningful indeed. So it's contextual. And a quick way to determine whether fudging for speed is appropriate to ask, if I just narrated this outcome without a die roll, would any player at the table be upset because they're deprived of meaningful choice? And would any player character experience a meaningful difference in the game world? And if the answer is no, then you might be okay to fudge. And there's only one other very rare circumstance where I think it's fudging. And that's fudging for verisimilitude when the alternative renders your world meaningless. Okay? So obviously campaign worlds can range from like these gonzo settings in which internal consistency kind of matters less than a wow factor. And so you have space cowboys riding psychic dinosaurs and fighting King Arthur, right? Or you can have like a naturalistic campaign where there's internal consistency that kind of trumps the wow factor. But even at the most gonzo, even the most wild campaign, you still have to have some sense of verisimilitude in order to maintain player agency. And that need for verisimilitude is going to be reflected in the mechanics of the gameplay, right? So the wandering monster table for my game Axe, for instance, they make it more likely to encounter crocodiles near rivers and camels in deserts. It would be really weird to find Nile crocodiles in the Himalayas or camels in a rainforest. And so a GM can use these wandering monster tables and have some assurance that they will produce results that have some sense of verisimilitude, right? Some sense of internal consistency. But sometimes, even on the Axe tables, the random rolls can produce outcomes that just defy any logic whatsoever. For instance, let's imagine at the start of a wilderness adventure, you're literally 1,000 yards from the adventurer's starting village. They roll their very first random encounter, and you get the lair of an ancient red dragon. This is like a once in 1,000 outcome. And now you've got this challenge as a judge. Why is there an ancient red dragon living next door to the starting village, and why did no one know about it? Now you might decide to run with this, right? Like you could say a dragon had only recently moved in and its presence wasn't yet known. Or you could say its presence had always been known, but that talking about it was taboo, so the villagers hadn't warned the players. Or you could say the villagers were actually evil cultists who worshiped the dragon, and they've sent the adventurers as sacrifices to die. And this is what's called abductive reasoning, right? It's finding a reason to explain a surprising fact in your game world that's arisen from randomness. And we're going to talk about abductive reasoning in a future episode. But it's also possible that you had previously established to the players that this was a safe village. Let's say they had communed to ask if it was safe there, and God said yes. Or they had hired a sage to brief them on all the local lore and monsters. Or they'd used magic to ascertain that there was no evil nearby. Or the players actually grew up in the village and knew everything about it. And in this case, now the dice have created a situation that makes no sense within the context of what's gone before. And so if you follow the dictates of the dice, you render your world meaningless. And so you should fudge the dice in this case to create a realistic situation. Now, somebody's going to say that this fudging deprives the players of meaningful choice, right? Oh, I wanted the meaningful chance to interact with the dragon. But as I've said before, player agency requires consistency. The players in your world cannot make meaningful choices if the world can just shift around them with no apparent consistency. And that's why there's times, rare occasions, but it does happen, where consistency has to trump the randomness of the dice. And that's about it. Those are the 2 examples where you can fudge without destroying agency. So going back to like our dark side example, you can call on the fudge for as many reasons as Luke Skywalker could call on force choke. To be clear, that's twice in the entire franchise, right? He force choked 2 Gamorrean guards when he was infiltrating Jabba's palace to rescue. Okay, before I go, I want to call out that I've got a Kickstarter ending in 3 days. It's for Ascendant Platinum Edition. I hope you will check it out. It's awesome. It's my super-powered role-playing game of infinite possibilities. Link is in the description below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to force choke the like and subscribe buttons. See you next episode.